Oh, okay, I want to talk about myths about Scotch. And one of the things that people ask about are, what is a single malt Scotch? What is a blended Scotch? What is the difference? Let's hear it from the master blender himself. What is the difference? Explain to me single malts versus blended.
Single malt's quite simple. A single malt is the product of one distillery that makes malt whisky. Single meaning one, and malt is the product from one distillery.
So it's not just that it came from the same barley or from the same batch. It has to come from the same distillery.
One distillery, yeah.
Same distillery. That's single malt. Okay, that's pretty easy to understand. It's a single malt Scotch. And so it could have the smoky flavor. It could have the non-smoky flavor. It could be aged. It could be young. Single malt.
Single malt from one distillery.
Okay, so what's a blended whiskey?
Well, a blended whiskey is a combination of single malt whiskies blended with grain whiskies. So it's a combination of all different characteristics from different parts of Scotland.
Oh, so blended whiskey is not just blended single malts. You wouldn't.
Oh no.
You don't blend just single malts.
No.
They're blended single malts plus the grain component.
The grain whiskey, yeah.
Well, what is a grain whiskey? Can I buy grain whiskey by itself and drink it? What's it called?
There's not that many of them, but there are. Grain whiskies are available. Grain whiskies were originally, if you go back many hundreds of years ago, when malt whisky was first being distilled in Scotland, it was distilled in a much smaller scale, and the whiskies were very, very powerful, coarse spirits made in small stills, and it wasn't really attractive to the majority of consumers. What the advent of making grain whisky was invented really by a Scotsman called Robert Steen, who invented what was called a patent still, which created a lighter style of whisky rather than the very heavily flavoured pot still whiskies, which was single malts. And the first master blender was a man called Andrew Usher, and Andrew Usher cleverly put together, using grain whiskies and the very heavily, richly flavoured malt whiskies, and created a drink which would be more easily accepted by the consumer.
What year was this about?
This was in the 1880s.
Okay, so late 1800s. His name was Andrew Usher?
Andrew Usher.
And so he was the inventor of Scotch?
No, he was not the inventor of Scotch. He was the first blender.
First blender, late 1800s, okay.
Put together grain whiskey and malt whiskey to make a drink that was more readily acceptable. Because people found that the flavours of single malts in those days, made in the small, what we call the small stills, very small stills, were very richly flavoured, heavily smoky in those days because it was done on a very small scale. And Andrew Usher put together, using a large volume of grain whisky and measuring in different quantities of different single malts to create what is blended whisky.
Is grain whisky made from barley as well?
It's made from either wheat or maize.
Oh, okay. So grain whiskey is not barley whiskey. It's made from wheat or maize.
Well, but there's a barley content in that.
Okay. And so, in order to have a blended whiskey, then it must be a blend of single malts and some grain whiskey.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
And it makes it far more attractive. And the reason that Scotch whisky became readily acceptable throughout the world, remember today, even though the huge attraction and the increase in sales of single malt is growing, the single malt market today of Scotch whisky only equates to 8% of the global market. 92% of the whiskies sold today in the world are all blended.
But isn't it true that single malts are generally more expensive than blends?
Well, they are, because malted barley is far more expensive than wheat or maize.
Okay.
And the process is slower because it's done in batch processes, whereas in grain distilling it's a continual process.
Okay. There we have it. Blended whiskies versus single malts.